So, thank you all, first of all, for this opportunity. I'm truly humbled and grateful to be able to talk to you guys about this important topic. I understand that there's probably going to be a lot of new lingo that really is talking about things that we already understand, but one of them is going to be social infrastructure. So for anyone that's not familiar, social infrastructure refers to networks of spaces, facilities, institutions, and groups that create affordances for social connection. So Fred did a great job talking about affordances and breaking down some of those concepts. And really what we're going to be talking about is how does this relate to our mental and ultimately social health. Okay, let's see if I can get the slides. So first, we're just going to be talking briefly about the loneliness epidemic and why it's so important as a health imperative. We're going to be talking about the built environment as a social determinant of health. What does that mean? Why does it matter? What's our role? And then lastly, get into some of the research around the power of third places and an evidence-based framework for design. And lastly, we were asked to sort of look at some of the design excellence from a social health lens or from a mental health lens, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about that as well. So first of all, what do we even mean when we say health? And so I just wanted to start off with the World Health Organization. Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not the mere absence of disease or infirmary. And really social health relates to how we connect with others, which is foundational to our overall well-being. It relates to how much trust we feel in our communities, and is closely tied to physical and mental health, is really interwoven. Also, I love this quote from the former acting US Surgeon General: "Architects are public health workers." I think that there's no doubt that we need to work in conjunction with our brothers and sisters in public health and across all of the spectrums to be able to embrace this and to take this on. So what are we talking about when we talk about loneliness and social isolation? I think a lot of times the terms are used in the same context. And really social isolation is the objective sense of being alone, having few or infrequent social contacts, versus lonely is that subjective feeling. So you can feel lonely in a crowded room, but both of them are really important. And when we look at the health risk associated with loneliness, they're astronomical. There are numerous meta-analyses, which are essentially where they take tons and tons of studies, pull all their data together and analyze them collectively. So these have shown that reports of loneliness and social isolation are worse for our health than a 15 cigarette a day smoking habit, and even worse than obesity. And I mean, I think, once we start to understand that, it impacts everything that we think about and the lens that we look at our environments. So we understand that loneliness by itself increases risk of death for 26%, social isolation by 29%, and just living alone by 32%. So a lot of bad news. The good news is being socially connected reduces death risk by 50%. And so I think, all of this is leading up to this understanding of loneliness as a national health epidemic. And that's what it's been called by the former US Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy. Apparently the US Surgeon Generals are like all I'm gonna quote here today. But one of the things to recognize is that, a lot of this work that I did was prior to COVID and the social distancing and all the work from home. And really, when you look at this pyramid of vulnerability, I think a lot of us, all of us are at risk for social isolation and for isolation. And those of us that have gone from low risk are kind of moving up that, and those at medium are now more highly at a higher risk. And so I think that, that just calls to me as what can we do to allow people to always be able to connect even in these times. Let's talk about what determines our health at all. So is it exercise, nutrition, socioeconomic status, clinical care? I think a lot of us immediately think of clinical care when we think of health. And the truth is, it's all of these, right? It's all of these. And the built environment has an important part of this overall ecosystem when we think about how it's impacting outcomes like mortality and health-related quality of life. And being an affordance, which is really just saying like, it's helping set people up for being able to have healthy behaviors, right? So we understand that if you don't have sidewalks and you don't have good tree coverage, it's hard to go out and walk. And if you don't have stairs or easily accessible stairs, you're most likely going to take the elevator. And all of these things are impacting our overall health. And really the physical environment, when we look at percentages, again, this is, large meta-analyses coming together to say, what percentage do these different components have to do with our overall health? And surprisingly, clinical care is just 20%, right? And the physical environment, we understand this 10%. I personally feel like is undergirding and is the foundation of all of these other components. So, looking at here, you can see even related to clinical care, how we position it, how accessible it is, all of that is shaped by the built and natural environment. Additionally, health behaviors and socioeconomic factors, thinking about people's access to healthy schools and to communities. So then looking specifically at loneliness. All right, so we understand that the built environment is one of many factors, but it's one that's especially important to us and that we have responsibility over. And so when we start to focus in on that, we understand that we can look at the design of homes and workplaces, third places and neighborhoods. And so let's talk about what that looks like when we're designing for social connection. One of the things that we understand, and I think you guys all got a copy of the report, but happy to share it afterwards, but is that the way that we're designing a place, that can be walkability, sense of place, greenness, all of that can increase our social interaction, the integration of diverse people, social support, civic pride, social resilience, and I find it fascinating that it can even impact social and political involvement. And really what that's about is when you're out on the streets, when you're connecting with your neighbors, and all of that is just a natural part of how our environments are created to help to foster, well, then we get more involved. We're naturally invited and we're naturally supported. So I'm going to be focusing on third places specifically and talking on those because that's a key part of my research. I'd like to break down for anyone that isn't familiar with third places or maybe just needs a refresh. Third places are informal and public. So if we think of our homes as private and informal, and perhaps our workplaces or schools as more formal but public, third places are these places where we can relax and be ourselves, but we're also in public and with other people. And there's no doubt that there's something that's naturally kind of supportive and makes you feel like a part of a community in these spaces. And one of the things that we know is that third places have the ability to strengthen social capital. And so social capital is really understanding of those social network ties that can do things like help you to find a job or to help you to get, support from a neighbor, especially in a time like right now. And they can also foster social connection, diversity, well-being. I think it's really important while we're talking about mental health to also look at understanding them as an enabling place. And so really what that means is, for people coming out of recovery or just honestly having a tough time, maybe struggling with depression, having a third place where you can go to be in community with other people, even if you're just sitting by yourself, is really important as an enabling place. And one of the things that the research shows is that it helps to match the social support deficit that we have elsewhere. And so really that means that, maybe if we live alone and we're not able to socialize very often, when we go to these third places, it's really providing a critical need for us. And it's not just thinking about, cafes or parks, it's really thinking about every scale. So even within our homes or within our offices, we also have little third places as well. Like, if we think of the coffee machine or, old school water coolers, that type of thing. And third places are really as unique as the people they serve. I mean, there's an amazing study that looks at trying to impact cardiovascular health and realizing that they were not able to make a dent in this population, and going into barbershops and being able to tap into people that are open and socially connected and provide those types of services. So it's really important to tap into what's important to the people in the communities that we're serving. All right, so talking specifically about my research, what I did is really zoomed out and said, what do we know? I feel like I've read multiple different pieces around why third places are important, why the built environment's important, but what is the framework for how to think about designing these places? What can we provide people? And really, it came up out of the literature, came these 6 different components of this framework: accessibility, activation, choice, human scale, nature, and sense of place. And these images right now are a little blurry, right? In that, what does this mean during this time of COVID? And I think that all of them are still very relevant as we navigate through this time and beyond, right? And when we hopefully are able to get to more of a new normal. But all of them still apply. So I'm going to spare us going into each one of these specifically and just really focus in on one example. But if we want to know more about any of them, I'm more than happy to talk about them. So I focused on accessibility. There's a lot of research that talks about just being able to access places of connection, to being able to have a neighborhood that's walkable, where people can know their neighbors, where they feel safe and welcome is really important. And there's a number of physical environment attributes that help to make that. One of the ones that we talk about all the time is just having a mix of land use, which is about having volume to support the businesses there, and also having people be able to have that intermingling and mixing of their neighbors and their colleagues and all of that. And I also think it's really important to think about one of the things that we're talking about right now are sidewalk widths, right? So how can people, kind of spill out onto sidewalks right now during COVID, but also throughout any time where the weather is nice, to be able to connect with one another and to be able to linger. I really love the research that Fred shared around the glass and steel building, because that's a central part of this as well. When people are in such a hurry to just get away from a building, it hampers their ability to feel comfortable and open to connecting, open to, for instance, offering help to a stranger or asking for directions, that type of thing. It's also important to think about all the things that we talk about in universal design when we think about having places where people can sit and to be sheltered and supported and away from the elements, but also thinking about the key location of those so that they can sit and people watch and be a part of things. I think, for all of these, we understand the physical environment is our primary domain, but that we have to work together with programming and policy to think about how do we impact this? How do we foster accessibility in these spaces? And what can we offer to our colleagues so that together we can cultivate change? So again, just thinking about these 6 design guidelines for creating third places to support social health. Accessibility, we talked about. Activation is really important when we think about how are people coming together in this place? What is it that allows it to turn from one purpose one day, maybe as an open field or soccer field, to being able to turn into a town hall meeting or a farmer's market. When we think about choice, there's no doubt of the importance of choice. When we think about how many people are we coming with? How exposed do we want to be? I think social connection and social health is not just about being the center of attention and connecting with everyone. It's also being able to be by yourself but in community. Because I think we all have times when along that spectrum we just want to be with other people but not have to necessarily engage. Human scale, another really important part, I think that Fred's research really tapped into as well, is some of that piece that's just in the DNA of places. In why do you just intuitively feel safe there or comfortable there or intrigued? Some of that is about edge conditions and about a lot of the things that he discussed. Again, nature, no doubt in the importance of that in helping people to feel comfortable and giving them an opportunity to, for instance, engage with community gardens or have some sort of thing that keeps them outside. And lastly, that sense of place. I think that, that's this hard to define component, but that makes places unique and that really represents the people that are in those places. So when I took this lens and went into the framework for design excellence, there's a number of ways that I sort of looked at framing them. And I have to apologize in advance because I know there's a ton of text, but we're just going to go through it. So first of all, when we were talking about designing for integration, I love the idea of utility, beauty, and delight. And I just think about, how we understand this as more than building skin deep, right? How is it creating affordances for people to delight and support one another and recognize the beauty in each other, not just the beauty in the physical form? When we think about designing for equitable communities, how do these places help to encourage walkability and make people feel safe, feel like they can connect with their neighbors and trust one another? I think an important part of the research is even just looking at whether people trust their neighbors is impacted by the physical environment. That's amazing to me. Things like, crime and how often people feel comfortable to walk. When we look at designing for economy, I think, that's one of the things where the social capital comes into play. Social capital innately supports the economy. When we think about helping people to have numerous bridging ties, which are like these ties where you're a friend of a friend and you know people more distantly, a lot of times those are the ones that can help people find employment and assistance. Designing for wellness, is really the most no-brainer of all of these. I think it's really thinking about how these spaces that we are designing help to shape the affordances to allow people to make healthy decisions and build trust in one another and feel like they're comfortable being in community with one another and sort of identifying each other as neighbors. I think, one of the things that was also mentioned was around those high rises. One of the things that we're starting to realize is, it's not just about single family or the high rise. Both of those have some drawbacks. And the high rise, one of the things that's a struggle is that people oftentimes don't feel a sense of ownership of anything. They don't feel a smaller sense of community. And in our DNA, we are meant to not connect with giant groups of people, but rather smaller groups of people that we have more intimate relationships with. And so, how do the designs of our environments help foster that? Then when we think about designing for change, I really liked this piece talking about reuse, because one of the things that we oftentimes forget is that existing structures in the community oftentimes have place attachment. They're really important to those people, and to be able to honor the local culture where they're being created, I think adaptive reuse is really important, not only from a materials standpoint, but also, or architectural standpoint, but also just thinking about how do we respect and pay homage to the communities and the cultures where they're being designed. Lastly, design for discovery. I think we're really just beginning to understand the link between our environments and our social health. And ultimately, we need more discovery. I think that's what Fred said as well, which is just, we need more research, and we're beginning to do that. And I know HKS, where I work, we're doing that right now on a number of projects. We're using standardized measures of loneliness and social connection. And all of that is about, bridging with other people outside of necessarily the traditional walls of architecture. So lastly, I leave you with this, which I think we can all agree, which is design is never neutral. It either supports health or it hinders it. And I think we're all committed here to supporting health. So thank you so much for this opportunity. I really appreciate you guys allowing me to share.
Great. Well, thank you, Erin. That was an excellent presentation. Want to kind of go through, have a few questions from the panel here. One being, is the pandemic revealing the realities of these connections more clearly? And if so, how?
Yes. So how? In a lot of ways, right? So one of which that I've talked about with my colleagues that are in the loneliness sphere is that for a long time, our biggest struggle was to get people to like use the word lonely, like to admit that like we ever feel lonely. And I think this pandemic has made us all go, oh yeah, I'm lonely. Yeah, me too. Like, yeah, it's just a part of our lived reality now. And I think that as we've had our social connections kind of pulled away from us in physicality, we've begun to realize how wonderful they were and how much we need them in the first place. And I would say, like, you know, for anyone that's heard my front porch crusade, we need spaces where we can still connect even in a pandemic, where we can have outdoor spaces that allow us to connect with others, but still be socially or physically distant, but socially connected. Great question, thank you.
And a kind of interesting, I think everyone probably has examples of this in their neighborhoods, but this pandemic has created, and some of it might be, you know, the inventory and stuff, but in our neighborhood, over the last 2 months, trying to buy a bicycle is almost
oh my God.
And it's funny, it's as if no one thought to ride a bike until the pandemic happened. And you kind of are like, that's not a bad thing that we're riding more bikes. So
yeah, totally.
I look for silver linings on some things. I mean, maybe this is a real gut check on maybe we should be doing things differently.
Yes, I completely agree.
Well, you know, that question now, again, we're talking in generality just in the overture, but when you think about it, how can the mental health considerations and design improve the life of marginalized communities in times of crisis, such as the pandemic? Some of the articles I've read, you know, some areas are more, you know, likely to have sidewalks with trees and so forth like that. So is there a direct corollary to that?
God, yes. God, yes. I mean, like, when people are talking about like maybe, I'm like, have you seen the astronomical body of research that is just totally heartbreaking, right? So yeah, I have a number of colleagues that, you know, did their dissertations essentially on this topic, and is it safe to be outside, and do you have, you know, safe crosswalks? And one of the things that, you know, I didn't mention, but is also just around like the speed of traffic next to you. Nobody wants to walk when there's a bunch of traffic next to them, especially not with their children, right? And so how are we looking at these communities? A lot of those communities are not, have a disproportionate lack of not only like third spaces, but any green spaces, you know, and of being able to have places where they can, you know, connect with others. So 100% yes, great question.
And the third one, as we move on to the next piece, I think everyone on this call, and I think most people, if they listen to this call, would agree with everything that we're saying. Everyone enjoys trees for the most part. You know, everyone likes public spaces.
Yeah.
But, you know, taking it from the, yes, this would be great to have, what are the next steps to actually implement this roadmap? And I'm kind of combining two questions. You know, what articles and books or authors of research do you think that us could come and start reading just to understand our own education? And the second part of that,
nerd's favorite question. Go on.
Yeah, so that's part one is what, you know, and it's kind of a scale, right? How do you get these affect change, and like how do you see the different levels, and what are the things that us as individuals can do immediately to start affecting this? Because it's hard to say your city should now have tree-lined sidewalks everywhere, but We got to start somewhere. What can we do today?
Yeah. Those are the best questions. I love them. Okay, books. I'm gonna have to I'll send more book recommendations. But two that I think are amazing are Happy City by Charles Montgomery and it's right out of reach over here. Places of the Heart by Colin Ellard. Both are phenomenal, and if you're an audiobook fan like me, they're both an audiobook, so that's awesome. Things that you can do right now. So honestly, within the report that I share, it has a billion different things that you can do right now, and it sort of says like, okay, where are you on the spectrum, and where do you have the ability to change things right now? I think for us, our first ability to change things is as citizens, but is also to think in this lens and to look at, you know, our designs in SD, for instance, and say, okay, and like, how do we think this is going to impact the surrounding community? Or how do we think this is going to impact the, you know, people that are working or living here? So great questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Erin. I think at this point we just slide it over or turn it back over to Amy and Stephen.
Thank you, Brendan. And thank you, Erin and Frederick. I think you both set the stage for a really productive dialogue, and we are so appreciative of the weight that you've placed on this issue. It's absolutely critical that we address this today. Frederick, you shed light on how the environments we live, work, and play in are changing our brains and our behavior, and how we have a responsibility to enable spaces to become places that meet our physical and behavioral needs. Erin, you looked at the built environment as a determinant of social connection and talked about social capital and how we really need to dig deeper than building skin. So I want to start us off with a productive dialogue here today, but really let all of you know that the next 10-15 minutes, this is not the end of this discussion. We wanted to start you all off thinking about these issues, hear your feedback and thoughts, and encourage you to talk amongst yourselves in your communities, and perhaps even join our incubator group meetings if you so desire. So the question I would like to start us off here today with is, how can we really leverage this moment of mental health destigmatization to encourage architects to design for mental health? What is the responsibility of architects to consider mental health in their designs? So what role does it play in the design of our equitable communities? And this is an opportunity for anyone to jump in. In order to allow many people to contribute to this discussion, I would encourage anybody to type next in the chat so we can call on you immediately. But I would like to open this up to anybody who's not currently on video first. You're welcome to go off mute, counselors, knowledge community members. I can also open it up to Erin and Frederick to set the stage if they would like.
Oh, I was trying to say, go ahead.
I can start it off just with an easy statement, and that is, we don't want to make this look as if it's another burden for the profession. That, oh, now I have to study this. But to have them understand that, as I pointed out before, that this is achieving certain power and recognition to be observed by your client and your eventual user, and to get a certain satisfaction level that you deserve as a professional. So this is an additive approach, but again, not a burden.
Thank you, Frederick. I would like to ask Melissa to share your thoughts, and then Gregory.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me? You can hear me. Okay.
Yes.
So thank you so much, too. I really appreciated both your presentations, Fred and Erin. And it seems like a lot of what we're talking about is very much an approach that is wonderful because we're thinking more proactively. But I also wanted to ask about some of what we're having to respond to in a reactive way. And just to give a quick context, I'm part of the Academy of Architecture for Justice, so that you know where this question is coming from. When I think of individuals in a mental health crisis, we know that those in crisis are more likely to encounter the police than get medical help. So I was curious, and Fred, well, it's actually addressed to either one of you, but if either had thoughts on a more systemic, proactive approach, like for instance, Fred, you referenced Jane Jacobs and others, and working with city planners in addition to the architecture and policy, there's so much trauma that can happen, you know, that's happening before maybe that initial intervention with police, but certainly then it's exacerbated as you continue through the system and then even at reentry. So just curious if you had thoughts or research that were more specific to even that area.
Yeah, well, we know that it's not good for you on the street, and then when you're incarcerated, it gets even worse. So it's proof that the environment is always working as a disturbance if it's not properly managed. And certainly we need to be more sensitive to the fact that much of the social problems that we face, and let's put aside perhaps personal biases of individuals, that if you grow up in fear, if you see no positive examples in front of you, then you're going to react a certain way. So how do we change this? Both Erin and I have talked about the fact that even in a diversified and questionable demographic group, you can provide certain places within their environment that they can collect and find a certain amount of relief from their personal space. And we just need to encourage cities to invest in that. And I think that's what people are saying in the streets as we've witnessed over the last month or so.
Yeah, Frederick, I think Mike shared a similar sentiment in the chat, saying let's focus our energies of those communities that have been disregarded, overlooked, and particularly those that are currently the most inequitable. Gregory, what did you have to share?
You know, both Fred and Erin, thank you for such a great I practice even more as an urban designer.
It's super hard to hear you, Gregory.
They're fine. Having computer problems. I'll type it into the chat.
Gregory, maybe if you wouldn't mind sharing your thoughts in the chat just for the sake of time, and we will share those aloud
later on. I think there's some good conversations happening in the chat as well. To reference back to Cheryl's point, you know, obviously the current civil unrest has quite a depth of issues that as a incubator group, we're only just beginning to sort of scratch the surface on by trying to get outside expertise, a perspective from people of color and those communities that are dealing with these really challenging times. One of the questions we've had is that, you know, we need to break down the silos between our practices, our disciplines, and our knowledge communities, and how we as the Institute can set policy and so forth to help address urban design issues, I think, that are also exacerbated by the current civil unrest. You know, how can we do better to make those third places more equitable, how to infuse those communities with opportunity and hope during this time.
Well, and I think like there's two, you know, when you think of design as both like a noun and a verb, like when we think about, you know, not only what is it that we're designing, but what is the process of our design, right? So how are we becoming better listeners? How are we understanding where we come from may not be where, you know, the communities that we're trying to serve come from. And so how do we become better listeners and then be able to serve and, you know, collaborate, I think is really important.
No, I love the emphasis on process as well as product. It's something that we have the opportunity as architects to make that mandate as we put forward our role in projects and how to make that stakeholder group as diverse as the communities we serve.
Yeah, and I've heard a few people sort of talk about design studios, and I think, you know, yes, like how do we get this as projects in schools to help people start to practice that and learn that as a part of what they see the practice of architecture being is around listening and serving.
Yeah, just to sit on a soapbox, community design in the profession is one of those things that I hold near and dear to my heart as an opportunity to use our skill sets for those communities that don't always have access to our design services. So obviously RUDATs and SUDATs and other things the Institute does as a body, but each AIA local chapter, AIS has its Freedom by Design program. There are opportunities to really get out there and address you know, needs at the point of the community. And I think we should all sort of dive into those because that has an impact on mental health as well, because then you really get to hear what those needs are.
Yeah, I think Betsy made like an amazing comment that is, you know, tangential to what we're talking about here. Do you want to she's just talking about, you know, for architecture grad students of color and learning. Oh yes, there you are, Betsy.
Sure, yeah, and this came about from my alma mater has ongoing a series of listening sessions, not presentations, but sessions for anybody, students, alum, and recent graduates and faculty to talk about their experiences. And it has been humbling and in some cases humiliating as a white woman to think that I have participated in a system that has allowed this to go on. But the description of one student used the word emotional violence of the studio jury system, which we've all participated in, but the impact of that on students of color who have not had the emotional support that the rest of us had even getting there has been devastating. And then to be told that their work is substandard because they're so stressed that they can't do a good job. You know, the mental health, comes back to what Fred was talking about and ability of the brain to function when under stress. So I think if we don't think about not just the places that we put students, but the situations that we have in architecture school and the training that it's giving us as professionals, we're really missing out on an opportunity to rethink all that.
Thank you.
So I think in the essence of time, I'll just sort of wrap this up real quick. I think we've had a lot of great material from our presenters and the questions from the counselors and the knowledge community leaders on the call today. I will say that if you're really interested in what our work is and want to inform that, please reach out to us. We are looking for more diversified stakeholders to give us that perspective that we don't have, and reach out to those communities so that we can make those mental health considerations as we continue our work. Other than that, thank you again, Frederick and Erin, for a great conversation today, and I'll hand it over to Berna Marie unless, Amy, you have anything else to add.
I just had a really quick point. And I think it brings up the idea, really just the notion that as we continue to learn, we will need to continue to learn more, and that these issues are not static, and that it's generationally impacted, it's circumstantially impacted. I think we all can say that what we're dealing with now is very different to what we thought we'd be dealing with maybe 3 months ago, looking at 2020. So how can we as architects and designers and community members be agile and willing to adapt to meet these needs? And I just thank you again to everybody for joining.
Thank you so much. Oh, Brianna.
Marie, you're muted, but I would love to hear what you're saying.
Sorry, I'm on. Am I on? Okay. Thank you, Amy and Stephen, for leading this presentation. Thank you to Frederick and Erin for leading a wonderful discussion. And I only look forward to hearing from the council, continuing this discussion, and again, collaborating with our study areas as we move forward throughout the year. There's a lot of great discussions to be had and overlap. I'd like to also